So a while back, Luton came out with a series of videos called The Dark Origins. And in the latest 2 that he's released at the time I'm recording this, in episodes 3 and 4, he talked about time travel, how time is perceived, how time is incredibly non-specific and inherently non-accurate as a way to describe reality and the motion between different events. And he did a great job. But he specifically looked at the hard science aspects, the things that could really happen, and then brought up a lot of physicists and their various observations to support. And that's brilliant. But when applied to an overall arching universe such as Warhammer 40k, something that is inherently fantastic since it literally involves psyker space magic, that is not a complete view of what could happen. So we need to take a step back and look at the more fantastic episodes of time travel, time dilation, and just general time fuckery within this universe, because it is very much applicable to this entire endeavor of fantasy. Because at its heart, this is still a very much fantasy-based universe. Again, freaking space magic. There are gods and monsters, demons and devils, some angels that you don't really get much information about, but they definitely exist. May or may not be evil. And entire breadth in between that. So looking at this as a hard science piece, while honestly fascinating, and I would love to hear more, is not the complete picture. And I'm just going to jump right in and look at that because I love all the aspects of time travel. I love getting in there and seeing the crazy wibbly wobbly timey-wimey stuff that happens. And I just enjoy this. I like looking at the parallel universe aspects. I like all this crazy nonsense that Luton admittedly is not a fan of. So he covered what he enjoyed, which makes perfect sense. And he did it beautifully. I will actually link the videos down below. If you haven't already, go watch them. They are masterclass works on just time interactions with reality to start with, and then applied to a really freaking amazing fantasy setting on top of that. Again, links below. Hit them up. But more importantly, let's look at how fantasy time travel and fantasy aspects specifically influence time in Warhammer 40k. To start with, though, we're going to need to do something a little unpleasant and show you how the sausage is made. Specifically, we need to acknowledge that this is a story that doesn't have a consistent writing team. Between the various editions from overall Warhammer 40k, between the multiple novels, some better than others, some that are Inquisitor. Still can't get over that one. Between all of that span of storytelling, and I'm very much stretching to include that Inquisitor with that. Why is that paining me so much? Between all of that span, there's a lot of discrepancies. And the way Games Workshop has handled this is to put out the phrase that they imply in universe, everything is real, not everything is true. So some of the stories are lies, some are embellishments, some are just wrong. And they will never specify which one. Some people believe there's retcons that happen. Others have pointed out accurately that these retcons are just temporary lack of usage because it's been a few editions since something come out. Like, for example, Zotes, which were a model on the tabletop and in lore were emissaries for the swarm of tyrannists to convince people in advance to say, hey, you know what? You should let them eat you. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's actually what they were in the original Rogue Trader lore. And then because a lot of things in Rogue Trader were just what people thought declared non-canon, they kind of disappeared. Until a number of years ago when they were brought back, so they have effectively reintroduced something that was theoretically retconned out, which Luton himself has gone into more detail, shows that retcons in 40k are BS. Let's go with BS. That's a YouTube safe way to say that. But all of this shows the overarching narrative for all of Warhammer is malleable. It changes. And to accommodate these changes, they will go back and revisit past events and change them to fit new information that came up later on. So the lore you know gets updated. There's the standard lore that you originally got. And then there's the changes, and then you get the new information. For example, the various ways the Primarchs are spread. Originally, Chaos did it. Then, when the Word Bearers did, and they were the ones who maybe separated the Primarchs. And then finally, in the recent book, Saturnine, spoilers for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, showed that the Primarch's mother is the one who separated all of them. Yeah, a bit of a spoiler there. There's 3 different variations of how that specific event happened. And any single one of them could be the real one, also at the same time. This shows that there are multiple revisions. And they're not going to tell you which one is the accurate one. But you can take most likely the most recent one because it's the one they're going with right now. Until something new comes out. So that will be the most accurate one because it's the most recent. Is that the most accurate overall? I don't know. And Games Workshop will not specify. But it's one of many possibilities. Could be more than one, could be multiple, could be none. Because, again, everything is real, not everything is true. But this shows how the writing aspects of this do change over time, and that's then applied to the story. You go back, you make the changes, and then you introduce what you need to move forward as if it had already existed. Now, this could have very little change or a lot of changes, depending on how you look at it. But the overall effect is, after so many changes, they add up. And the amount of information you have at the highest, most current timeline, which would be mostly the 40K timeline, is different than what it was originally. There's so much more in the backstory than there was originally. There's so much more information about the Primarchs, about pre-Golden Age information. There's just information that did not even become conceived of as an illusion, as a dream, as a random thought bubble on the side of someone's head, because that's definitely how thoughts are created. You just see them floating around. It's exactly like that, except nothing like that. But jumping back into the actual universe itself, we can see that a revisionist history actually has a phraseology that is used in fiction quite frequently. It's called a Jacob's Ladder. It's where you make an entire pass through history, and at each level you achieve something, and you go all the way up and you drop back down, and you go all the way up and you drop back down, and you go all the way up and then you drop back down. But you don't drop as far each time. You make incremental changes that affect where the overarching flow of history moves. That's essentially how a revisionist history looks in practice in universe. On the outside, it's the various authors involved in the IP making changes to the story to make it fit better with what they want to do. In practice, though, what it looks like is this is what we have. We made a change here, and it brings us to here. We see different levels of reality being explored. Those previous ones are still the lore people know, and they're still real. They're just changed, but they're still valid, which is incredibly important when actual time travel becomes very necessary. Now, I don't mean that it's important. I don't mean that it happens frequently. It actually does, because space travel is based on the warp, which is chaotic. Let's just go with that. The Emperor being the oh my god no level psyker, and yes, I did choose those words very intentionally, would definitely have access to that. But more importantly, he has access to his age. He has access to knowledge beyond what anyone should have, and immortality. So he's quite aware of what's going on, and he had many allies who were maybe not as powerful as him, but very much as old and as knowledgeable as he was. Again, highly spoilerific for certain Saturnine aspects. Seriously, that book just dropped a lot of bombs. Again, if you haven't, I'd recommend reading it. Especially since I'm just going to spoil a lot of shit, so do that. What I mean to say is, this looks like the setup of more than just glimpses of the future, but much of his actions resemble someone intentionally acting based on foreknowledge. We know the Emperor's old, and we know that he was around well before the collapse of humanity. The current leading theory for the Emperor is that he was very old and was essentially a protector of humanity. And it was kind of confirmed in Saturnine, where essentially they were describing Greek gods. They never really said it, but it is just throwing it out there. What we need to look, though, is that this would have placed him within the golden age of humanity, which is very important because the golden age of humanity actively utilized time travel. We know this because of the short story that involved the usage of a ship to go forward in time, freak out, and get killed by the denizens of the 40K Millennium. The ship went bonkers. There's an entire story about that. It's actually covered quite a good deal, and again, Luton09's channel. I'd recommend just watching all of his videos. I kind of would. I'm a massive nerd. I get that. I would love to recommend all his videos. In fact, I will do that. But the important aspect of this is that it shows time travel is something that was actively pursued, as well as various other engines the Dark Angels had that were aware of time. So there's two different aspects of time travel that are confirmed readily within 40K. Both are golden age of technology, human-level time travel machines. If there are exactly two ways to show time travel was a thing, and yet they somehow were destroyed by their own creations, there's not many ways that can go, because it creates a logical block. How can a species that has time travel be completely destroyed, but not so destroyed that there are survivors to go on to create the Warhammer franchise? This is where time travel becomes incredibly important, but also dips heavily into theory crafting. So take everything I say with a couple of spoons of salt, not just a pinch or a few grains. Just take a salt shaker at this point. There are only certain logical conclusions you can come to. One, time travel had to play a part in that war, because the golden age of technology fell, at least based on the current lore, which may or may not be accurate, and probably both, because 40K, everything's accurate, nothing's accurate, when, as far as we know, their machine servants, essentially slaves, rebelled, and they more or less got their butts kicked. I am heavily oversimplifying this here. The thing to remember here, though, is this is a time period when either side of that war among humanity would have access to time travel because it already existed. And once you acknowledge time travel exists, once you have used more than one device exploiting that, you have to assume there are more. Because the golden age technology was not a short time period. It was quite a significant chunk of the 40K timeline. And there's only so many ways you can fight an extra temporal war. And one of those ways would be to outflank someone, specifically to go before them, to act before they did. This is a concept that was essentially covered in Doctor Who during the Time Wars, where they would undo sections of their enemy so that they never existed, so they never attacked, and that was the attack itself, was undoing war. They go into more detail in the show itself. So things would pop into existence, but then the next attack would be undoing the attack, so that, paradox on top of paradox. That doesn't really happen in 40K. There's no real paradox effect. Because if you take the Orc story, where he went back in time and killed his past self for an extra copy of his gun, if that's taken as accurate, and it's the Orcs, so I'd actually assume it is, because they're so insane that they function on the principle of comedy, which I honestly think makes it more likely to be real. Personal take, though. Then, this is not a sum-zero universe. The Warhammer 40K universe can exist with multiple variations. They can override and then just move forward, like the Jacob's Ladder I mentioned earlier. So they would outflank someone, they would take something from the Golden Age and go back. And that would be moving forward from that point. But then since the other side would also have action, they would go back. What this would end up as is whatever would finally happen would be a fight between two factions who move so far back they can move no further back to the earliest points of history. And this is where the theory crafting becomes very intense. But surprisingly, in ways I wasn't ever expecting, backed up by some of the newer lore at the end of 8th edition, beginning of 9th. Let's back up a step. In the Pariah Nexus, during that section of the Psychic Awakening, the Sisters of Battle encountered essentially a soul dead zone. Sounds easier to say it that way. And through a course of many events, betrayals and fights, great drama, and generally I'd actually recommend going look at it. It's actually one of the better written ones. They came to a Necron structure where a Catan shard was held. This is where things get wonky. The shard recognized the humans and saved them. It actively took them and relocated them to safety. It didn't ask for anything, it didn't make demands, and it didn't spot fry them, which it could very easily do before turning its wrath on the Necrons because it was free and not contained. Which is so much a difference. Catan shards are not benevolent. They are not kind. They are walking aspects of a metal god that, according to the current lore as far as we have, the Necrons contained and then were kind of soul butcherized from. It's a technical term, but also completely accurate. The shard saved the people. That has implications. Because Catan shards were never, in any media form, recognized as nice. They don't act benevolently. They don't act without knowledge. They would act for destruction because rage is a thing after being trapped in usually a vault and used as a power source by former slaves. Essentially, yeah. It saved the contingent of Sisters of Battle, or the Battle Sisters or Adeptus Sororitas, take your pick. That implies knowledge. That implies at least that shard knew enough to get them out, because they were dead to rights. The Battle Sisters in this novelization had no reasonable expectation of survival until they literally had a Deus Ex Machina in the most true sense of the way, because it was literally a god that came out of a machine. Sorry, just more of an aside. That's literally the best way to use it ever, and I kind of love it because of that, but that's just me. This is one of the reasons I think this next bit of theory crafting actually holds water as a very new revision to the overall lore. Previously, Catan, pretty damn evil. Previously, the shards weren't shards, they were whole Catan. But then it's just a piece of one. And now we're getting to the point where they're not just mindless monsters, they are apparently able to save people, think that far ahead, and do it to beings that they shouldn't have any knowledge of, because at least as far as the lore has shown so far, humanity was not around during the War in Heaven, which is what brings us back to time travel. Again, I am prefacing this as many times as I can. This is heavy theory crafting here. But it's also theory crafting that is incredibly relevant. If you look at the overall possibilities of how do you outflank someone in time travel, you just have to go to the past. The only way farther back is pre-War in Heaven. And the two different races you would have there are the two most extreme examples of what a biological force taken to the next level and a technological force taken to the next level would look like. They would have to almost abandon physicality. And you would arrive at the Catan shards, which were essentially highly materialistically based beings. By materialistically, I mean they were in the materium. They were essentially sapient energy floating around stars to consume them, like some of the weapons that were used within the Golden Age of technology by the humans. And then you would have the old ones, which were essentially psychic abominations or psychic godly beings who could essentially do anything. but really valued life and didn't really go for much of the technological aspects. They could do it, but they really went more for, hey, you know what's going to be fun? Let's create an entire race of space elves to do our bidding with magic. I'm sure some of the people listening to this have figured out where I'm going with this. The ultimate way to preempt your enemy is to time travel. And we know of two factions who resemble what the two factions in the Golden Age technology look like. Part of the lore that may or may not be accurate, not just for the usual reasons of, well, everything is real, nothing's real, but because aspects of this are from the Necron perspective and quite old and acknowledged to be very shoddy even by their own standards, say that when they first made contact, when the Necrontyr, the precursor to the Necrons, back when they had souls, made contact with the Shards, or I guess the Catan at the time, they were told that the Old Ones were their enemies, and they had previously fought a battle. The common consensus is that is a lie. Because, at least as far as 40k lore goes, the War in Heaven that came later was the first major conflict. That might not be entirely wrong, though. Again, going back to time travel, if you go all the way back and you acknowledge that you would have to escalate to unfathomable levels to transfer that much of anything that far back, it would make sense that the AI constructs that didn't have souls would essentially resemble Catan shards, energy-based beings that can consume energy of the sun and gaseous expulsions to power themselves, which is essentially what they were, sun eaters, prior to the Necrontyr finding them. And the Old Ones were essentially psychic gods. They don't really have much knowledge of them, but they were essentially godly beings in a time when the warp was more stable. So yeah, what I am going into here is we are looking at the final progression of a Jacob's ladder, where both sides escalated to godly levels of ability, but it looked like the Old Ones were winning that one. And yes, I'm explicitly saying, if you go with time travel as a possibility, where you don't stick to the hard science, timeline corrections, if you don't stick to a deterministic view where certain things can't happen, if you acknowledge time travel can happen, the logical explanation to take this to is both sides would move themselves to the point of their most powerful, most overwhelming force to the earliest point possible to preempt their enemy. So that does set up the War in Heaven as the greatest war, because it would have started with the hardest, the most creative, the most destructive enemies of both factions being moved back as far as they can go to preempt the other. Until there's no preempting, and they end up just having the biggest battle right at the beginning. Or in this case, nothing really happened that we know of because the battle hadn't started yet. And the War in Heaven was that ensuing battle. Now, much of this is heavily theory crafted. The warp connects to everywhere and nowhere at once, and you can go anywhere within it, anywhere within the webway, which is a subdimension connected to the warp. But that means so much because it lets different beings at different levels of that Jacob's ladder move between them. The ultimate expression right now is essentially the War in Heaven, but it makes sense that, at least based on the current timeline, or progression of timelines, what you have is an overall knowledge of what happened. The Emperor would be aware of this. He would be aware of what happens. And he would also be aware that the godly route the Old Ones took, or I guess Golden Age humanity took, would not effectively work because, well, based on his perspective, they failed. Because if they had succeeded, humanity would not have well, had to fall. It's as simple as that. He knows it doesn't work. It's why he's so anti-God. It's why he knows certain things are going to happen. Because he knows how this story plays out. And it's also why things like the books in the Black Library, how Chigorax, I can never say his name, books, specifically the ones that show what will happen next, how the various prophecies of the Star Child and all those other aspects play in. Because they're not really telling the future. They're telling what has already happened in various changes. It's entirely possible to say the reason so much of the early history notes that the warp was calm is because there was so much less time fuckery. But as things got more entangled, as the future intruded on the past further, as part of a war that actively involved both sides with time travel and actively fucking with reality, it got more and more entangled, more and more crazy. It makes sense to twist reality. But this is all heavy theory crafting, and much of it could be accurate, could not be accurate. I don't know. But I do know that if you acknowledge time travel, if you acknowledge it in any way that is accurate to fantasy as opposed to hard science, I personally would love it, and it's fascinating, but I love anything to do with time travel. I just don't believe that it would work in a retcon, revisionist heavy storyline where it is done that way by necessity due to multiple authors over multiple decades. So we have to look at this as a time travel as a possibility. Time travel as the way to get around your enemy. Time travel is the only way to fight is going back in time. Time travel is setting up the stage to finish the Golden Age by going back to the beginning and fighting it out there. The war in heaven was the conclusion of the Golden Age of humanity, writ large in the first battlefield they can go to without preempting the others, because there was nowhere before it. And right now, we're not so much looking at the overall effect, we're looking at the next step. We're looking at the Emperor being anti-God, being against being worshipped, because he knows where this goes. He's seen this play out before, because it already has. Essentially, though, when you look at time travel, you have to look at it as the logical conclusion is not to find the future, because anything you can do is undoable. Because if someone wants to undo your actions, they just need to go before it and keep them from happening, or steal your objective, or just somehow fuck with you, because they know where it happened and they just go right before it. You have to go to the beginning, because that is the only place where you cannot be preempted. It's essentially putting your back to the wall. In this case, the wall is time. This is why time travel in a revisionist history has to behave like this. Because it has to reset. It has to keep going and being refreshed. It has to do this. This is the only logical way to do it. Because whenever you have something fantastical, logic becomes so much more important. Reality itself is chaotic. Reality, things happen without reason. But in fiction, that can never happen. And I have enough faith in the writers behind the Horus Heresy to realize they are aware of that. You cannot, in any way, shape, or form, say, and this random guy exploded. Moving on. Could that happen in reality? Yeah, there could be 1,000 random coincidences that makes that happen. But that is not a story. 40K has a narrative. 40K has actual writers working on who have started to coordinate. The Horus Heresy moving on to create characters like Constantine Valdor and certain other series he might be in that are even more spoilers than I'm willing to even acknowledge. Go look at some of the Curious videos if you want to find out. I will not spoil them. Like, I will spoil the Saturnine stuff because I think it's been out long enough, but anything involving Constantine Valdor, I will not spoil, but he's been inserted as a revisionist history into other aspects of lore that are clearly important to the story moving forward. But to understand where the story started, we're not looking at the first timeline. We're not looking at the second or the third. We're probably looking at the 50 millionth. This is why so much of what the Emperor is, why a lot of his comments, they sound uncaring. They sound, when you look at his writing, as if he knows something no one else does. But you also know he's lying about so much, because just his entire premise of the Imperial truth has to be a lie, because he knows gods are real, because he's fighting them. It only makes sense if he has knowledge of the future. But he's stuck in the prophecy trap, because while he could go back He probably could find access to technologies that would go back to the past, but he also knows they fundamentally won't help him because the past has already been moved to the point where he can't really change it. They escalate and they escalate and they escalate until the two most powerful forms, the Catan and the old ones, essentially were having god fights in ancient history. And that's how that plays out. And he's moving forward with the most human version, as according to him, which is, again, heavily pointed out not to be entirely sane and entirely good, but again, best good, not good good. This is just one of those things that is so important to realize, though. And this is all heavy theory crafting, but it's also theory crafting that does fit within a logical framework built up by fantasy-style logic, which is usually the easiest framework to move through when you have a story involving multiple authors who will not agree, and you need to make revisions just to account for things you need to introduce later that should have existed previously, but the previous authors would not have known because you hadn't created it yet. This is the way you have to look at, not because it's the most fun, although I personally enjoy it, but because with this style of overarching narrative, it's kind of required. You have to have a revisionist history, because otherwise it just becomes bloated and bogged down, and eventually you're going to get to the point where it's like, yeah, we need to just kind of restart altogether because it's too much. Yeah. There's other franchises that do this. I'm looking at you, Marvel and DC. Because their stories become bloated, they become unwieldy, they become disorganized. And while that can happen in 40K, a lot of it is, well, here's the original story, but then we changed it. We're not just adding on a new layer of, oh, hey, now you're a Nazi. Again, I'm looking at you, Marvel. But it changes aspects to make them different. They can go back and make an edit that's not just a few changes here, but an honest-to-God revision that's massively important because it does change the story. And I might be adding a little advice that please go retcon Inquisitor. I don't care if you have to fix it. I don't care if you have to delete it. Just do it, please, please. That's unrelated. This is all how you have to approach it. Even when you look at the hard science aspects, like Luton himself went into, honestly, incredible detail with. Again, links below, check them out. It doesn't really make sense when you have so many people writing the lore itself. If you had told me there was one lore master who was running all of the 40K lore for decades now, I could see that happening. I could see someone making the time to integrate all of it. But there's just too many cooks in the kitchen when it comes to the lore for that to be a feasible method to work. This is why I would heavily recommend looking into the Jacob's Ladder, the revisionist style time travel, and the logical conclusions it would lead up to. If you enjoy this video, though, click on Luton's. He did a great job of looking at the other aspects, the hard science fiction aspects that are honestly fascinating because they apply so much more to reality, where these apply so much more to just fiction and fiction writing in general, which I personally love, but I know because I actually bugged him about this, are not things he enjoys. So yeah, let me know what you think. Do you think this is a viable? Foible? Definitely a foible. Let me know what you think, though. I am very curious. I want to hear what you think. Am I completely off the mark? Do I have a point? Or am I maybe on to something, but you think it's going a completely different direction? I don't know. And knowing 40K's lore, it could go either way and both at the same time because everything is accurate and nothing is accurate. You know, the more I say that, the more I really hate that phrase. So again, links below to Luton stuff. Make sure to hit them up. And if you can, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and let me know if you want to see more of this because I like these kind of videos and I would love to just make this entire chat cast, bring in people who are also really into the 40K lore and just bullshit about these kind of aspects. But that's just something for later. It's something I just kind of want to do, and I want to run it by you guys. Would you be interested in watching that? I do this kind of thing on my own time right now as it is, especially in like Discord. But if you guys want to actually just listen to it, let me know because I love geek fights about this kind of stuff. It's fun. And I just, this right now, this is just me having fun. I enjoy doing this. So thanks for watching, everyone. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, hit that bell notification, and then actually hit up Discord for actual notifications because YouTube notifying people, that's funny. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Adios.